June 4, 1942. Dawn broke over the central Pacific, painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. Four massive aircraft carriers cut through the calm waters northwest of Midway Atoll, their flight decks bustling with activity as deck crews prepared aircraft for the morning's operations. These were not ordinary warships. They were the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the steel backbone of the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. For 6 months, these carriers had ruled the Pacific without challenge, their aircraft raining destruction on Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Colombo, and a dozen other targets across 2 oceans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, observing the organized chaos of launch operations with the practiced eye of a career naval officer. Around him, his staff worked with quiet efficiency, coordinating communications between the 4 carriers and their escort vessels. Everything proceeded according to plan. The morning strike against Midway's defenses had already departed, 108 aircraft now winging their way toward the American-held atoll. A second wave stood ready on the flight decks, their bellies loaded with torpedoes in case American ships appeared. The Japanese had learned to be prepared for anything. What Nagumo and his officers could not know, standing there in the early morning light with confidence born of half a year of unbroken victories, was that they had already lost the battle. The decisions made in the next hour would seal the fate of not just these 4 carriers, but of Japan's entire offensive capability in the Pacific. In 5 minutes of catastrophic violence, the balance of naval power would shift irreversibly. The myth of Japanese invincibility would shatter like glass. And the men who had carried the banner of the rising sun across half the Pacific would watch in horror as their world literally went up in flames. This is the story of those 5 minutes. But to understand how 4 of the world's most powerful warships could vanish so completely, so quickly, we must first understand what brought them to this point. We must understand the weapon that made Japan unstoppable, the strategic gamble that led them to Midway, and the desperate American response that would turn technological disadvantage into the most decisive naval victory in history. The aircraft carrier revolutionized naval warfare in a way few weapons systems ever have. For centuries, naval power meant battleships, massive floating fortresses armed with enormous guns that could hurl shells weighing over a ton across miles of ocean. The nation with the most battleships, with the biggest guns and thickest armor, controlled the seas. Naval doctrine, strategy, and tactics all revolved around these steel leviathans. Officers built their entire careers around battleship tactics. Navies spent fortunes constructing them. The battleship was the ultimate expression of naval power. Then came the aircraft carrier, and everything changed. Instead of measuring naval power by the size of your guns, it became about the reach of your aircraft. A carrier could strike targets hundreds of miles away, far beyond the range of any battleship gun. The carrier didn't need to see its target. It didn't need to close to gun range. It could launch its aircraft and destroy enemy ships before those ships even knew the carrier was there. The implications were staggering. Naval warfare was no longer about 2 fleets meeting in a gun duel. It was about finding the enemy first, launching your aircraft first, and destroying the enemy before they could strike back. The Japanese understood this better than anyone. While other navies viewed carriers as support vessels, useful for scouting and protecting the battleships that would win the real fight, Japan embraced the carrier as the primary striking arm. They built large, fast carriers capable of operating substantial air groups. They developed specialized aircraft optimized for carrier operations. Most importantly, they trained their naval aviators to a level of skill that was, in 1941, unmatched anywhere in the world. The Mitsubishi Is-6M0 fighter was a revelation when it appeared over China in 1940. Incredibly maneuverable, with exceptional range and climb rate, it outperformed every fighter it encountered. Allied pilots who tangled with Zeros in the early months of the war discovered to their horror that their aircraft couldn't turn with it, couldn't climb with it, and often couldn't even run from it. The Zero could follow them anywhere. In the hands of Japan's veteran naval aviators, pilots who had honed their skills over years of combat in China, the the Zero was devastating. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, called Kate by Allied intelligence, was equally impressive. It could carry either a torpedo or an armor-piercing bomb, and Japanese crews had perfected the techniques for using both weapons against ships. The torpedo attack was particularly feared. Japanese pilots practiced constantly, learning to drop their torpedoes at precisely the right altitude, speed, and distance to achieve maximum probability of hit. Their success rates in training exceeded anything American or British naval aviation could match. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber, codenamed Val, completed the offensive triad. In a screaming dive that could reach speeds over 350 miles per hour, Val pilots could place their bombs with uncanny accuracy. The combination of speed, angle, and timing required to pull out of such a dive without crashing, while still hitting a moving target, demanded extraordinary skill. Japanese dive bomber pilots had that skill. These three aircraft types, operating from carriers, gave Japan the ability to project devastating power across vast distances. A carrier task force could appear off an enemy coast, launch its aircraft, destroy targets hundreds of miles inland, and be gone before effective retaliation could be organized. This was exactly what happened at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. 6 Japanese carriers approached Oahu from the north, launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves, and inflicted catastrophic damage on the American Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous support vessels were hit. 188 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Over 2,000 Americans died. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. It was the most lopsided naval victory in modern history, achieved entirely by carrier-based aircraft. Not a single Japanese surface ship fired a shot. The Kido Butai had announced its arrival as the dominant naval force in the Pacific. What followed was a campaign of conquest that stunned the world with its speed and completeness. Japanese forces swept south into Southeast Asia, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. Everywhere they went, the carriers provided air superiority. Land-based Allied aircraft, when they could get airborne at all, were decimated by Japanese fighters. Ships that ventured out without air cover were slaughtered by torpedo and dive bombers. The few Allied carriers in the region, outnumbered and outclassed, were either sunk or forced to retreat. The British Eastern Fleet, driven from Singapore, attempted to operate from Ceylon. On April 5, 1942, the Kido Butai appeared off the island and launched strikes that devastated the port facilities at Colombo. 3 days later, the Japanese found and sank the British carrier Hermes and 2 cruisers off the eastern coast of Ceylon. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force in history, was driven from the Indian Ocean by Japanese carrier aviation. It was humiliating and terrifying in equal measure. For the men serving in the Kido Butai, these months were intoxicating. They had trained for years for this moment, and now they were proving that their doctrine, their aircraft, and their skills were superior. Every target fell. Every enemy fleet retreated or was destroyed. The carrier aviators became heroes in Japan, their exploits celebrated in newspapers and newsreels. Young men across the empire dreamed of joining their ranks. But this string of victories concealed growing problems that would prove fatal. The first was pilot attrition. Every operation, no matter how successful, cost aircraft and crews. A plane damaged by anti-aircraft fire and unable to return to the carrier meant 1 less aircraft and 1 less trained pilot. In the early months, these losses seemed insignificant against the backdrop of victory. But they accumulated. Each loss was a pilot who had trained for years, whose skills could not be quickly replaced. Japan's naval aviation training system was designed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
To produce a small number of superbly trained pilots. It could not scale up to replace heavy losses quickly. The second problem was operational tempo. The Kido Butai had been at sea almost constantly since December. Ships needed maintenance. Aircraft needed overhaul. Crews needed rest. But the operational demands kept coming. There was always another target, another objective. The carriers would return to port, conduct hasty repairs and replenishment, and sortie again. Maintenance issues began to pile up. Aircraft availability declined as planes waited for parts or repairs. Crews grew exhausted. The third problem was strategic. Japan had achieved its initial objectives with stunning speed. The resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia were secured. The defensive perimeter was established. But now what? The original plan had assumed that America, faced with the cost and difficulty of fighting across the Pacific, would negotiate a settlement that left Japan in control of its conquests. Instead, America was mobilizing for total war. New ships were being laid down. New aircraft were entering production. Training programs were expanding to produce the pilots and crews to man them. Time was not on Japan's side. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, understood this better than most. He knew Japan could not win a protracted war against America's industrial might. Japan's only hope was to inflict such devastating defeats early in the war that American public opinion would favor negotiation over continued bloodshed. Pearl Harbor had been the first blow. But it hadn't been enough. The American carriers, absent from Pearl Harbor that day, remained a threat. Yamamoto needed to bring them to battle and destroy them. His opportunity came with the American carrier raid on Tokyo in April 1942. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier Hornet, struck targets in Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The material damage was negligible. The psychological impact was enormous. The Japanese home islands had been attacked. The emperor himself had been placed in danger. The military leadership was humiliated. Yamamoto saw his chance. He proposed an operation to seize Midway Atoll, a small American outpost halfway across the Pacific. The Americans would be forced to respond with their carriers to defend this strategic position. The Kido Butai would be waiting. The American carriers would be destroyed. American naval power in the Pacific would be broken. The war would be won. The plan was approved over objections from some staff officers who worried about overextending Japanese forces. Yamamoto got his operation. He would take the Kido Butai, now reduced to 4 carriers after Shokaku and Zuikaku were damaged and depleted in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and strike Midway. The Americans would come. The Japanese would crush them. What Yamamoto didn't know was that the Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes. They were reading his messages, following his planning, and preparing their own surprise. The Americans knew the attack was coming. They knew where. They knew when. And despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and flying inferior aircraft, they were going to fight. The American position in mid-1942 was desperate. Pearl Harbor had been a disaster, but not quite the knockout blow the Japanese had intended. The 3 American carriers in the Pacific, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been at sea during the attack and survived. They represented America's only offensive capability against the Japanese juggernaut rolling across the Pacific. Everything depended on keeping those carriers alive and operational. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 had shown both the promise and the peril of carrier warfare. American and Japanese carriers had fought the first naval battle in history where the surface ships never saw each other. All the fighting was done by aircraft. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington, a terrible blow. But they had turned back the Japanese invasion force headed for Port Moresby, preventing Japan from threatening Australia directly. More importantly, they had damaged 2 Japanese carriers badly enough to keep them out of the upcoming Midway operation. It was a tactical defeat but a strategic draw that gave the Americans a glimmer of hope. Still, the odds at Midway looked terrible. The Japanese were bringing 4 fleet carriers with a total of 270 aircraft, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Americans had 3 carriers. Yorktown had been badly damaged at Coral Sea, but in a heroic dockyard effort at Pearl Harbor, work crews repaired her in just 3 days. Work that should have taken 3 months was compressed into 72 hours of around-the-clock labor. Yorktown wasn't fully repaired, but she could fight. Combined with Enterprise and Hornet, the American carriers could put roughly 230 aircraft in the air. On paper, it looked close to even. But numbers didn't tell the whole story. The Japanese aircraft were superior in almost every category. The Zero outperformed every American fighter. The Kate and Val were more effective than their American equivalents. Japanese pilot quality was higher, their crews more experienced. The Japanese had been winning for 6 months. American forces had been losing. Morale and confidence heavily favored Japan. The Americans had 2 crucial advantages that would prove decisive. The first was intelligence. Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptanalysis unit at Pearl Harbor, had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to give Admiral Nimitz detailed information about Japanese plans. Nimitz knew Midway was the target. He knew when the attack would come. He knew the composition of Japanese forces. This intelligence allowed him to position his carriers northeast of Midway, waiting to ambush the Japanese when they committed to their attack on the atoll. The second advantage was leadership. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded Task Force 17 centered on Yorktown. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet. Fletcher was the overall commander, but both men understood the stakes and were prepared to take risks. They had to. This wasn't about cautious maneuvering and preserving forces. This was about destroying the Japanese carriers even if it meant sacrificing their own ships. Nimitz had made it clear. The mission was to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. Everything else was secondary. The American aviators knew they were flying inferior aircraft. The Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber was obsolete, slow, and vulnerable. Its Mark 13 torpedo was notoriously unreliable, with a failure rate that often exceeded 50%. Devastator crews had to approach their targets at low altitude, slow speed, flying straight and level for the final attack run. Against heavy anti-aircraft fire and defending fighters, it was close to suicide. They knew it. They flew anyway. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber was better, a solid if unspectacular design that could carry a 1,000-pound bomb and put it on target with reasonable accuracy. But attacking a carrier required the pilot to dive through anti-aircraft fire, release at the last possible moment to ensure accuracy, then pull out of the dive while enemy fighters swarmed around. It demanded courage and skill. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter was outmatched by the Zero in every category except durability and firepower. American pilots couldn't dogfight with Zeros. They had to use different tactics, relying on diving attacks from altitude, using their superior diving speed and hitting power to engage quickly and disengage before the more maneuverable Zero could bring its advantages to bear. It worked, sometimes. But it required discipline and coordination that American fighter squadrons, thrown together quickly with limited training time, often lacked. On paper, the Americans shouldn't have had a chance. The Japanese advantages in aircraft quality, pilot skill, and operational experience should have been decisive. But war is not fought on paper. War is fought by human beings making decisions under pressure, often with incomplete information, always with the knowledge that mistakes cost lives. The next hour would demonstrate that better equipment and better training can be overcome by better intelligence, better timing, and sometimes just better luck. As dawn broke on June 4th, Nagumo's carriers launched their first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, a mixed force of fighters, dive bombers, and level bombers, headed for the atoll. Nagumo kept back a second wave of aircraft on his carrier decks, armed with torpedoes in case American ships appeared. Japanese doctrine emphasized flexibility. The reserve strike could be launched against ships or, if no ships appeared, rearmed with bombs to finish off Midway's defenses. The carriers maintained a defensive patrol of fighters overhead, protecting against American aircraft based on Midway that would surely attack once the Japanese presence was known. The Japanese had been detected. American patrol aircraft from Midway had spotted the carriers early that morning. The atoll's defenders knew what was coming. Every available aircraft on Midway scrambled. Fighters rose to intercept the incoming strike. Torpedo planes and bombers went looking for the Japanese carriers. It was a desperate, uncoordinated effort. The aircraft were obsolete types that the Navy had sent to Midway because they weren't good enough for carrier duty. Brewster Buffalo fighters, Vought Vindicator dive bombers, even a handful of Army Air Force B-26 Marauder medium bombers modified to carry torpedoes. The pilots were brave. Their aircraft were inadequate. The Japanese strike hit Midway with practiced precision. Anti-aircraft fire was heavy, and American fighters managed to shoot down a few attackers, but the Japanese bombers hit their targets. Fuel tanks erupted in flames. Buildings collapsed. The power station was destroyed. But the airstrips remained operational, and American anti-aircraft guns still fired. The Japanese strike leader radioed back that a second attack would be needed to suppress Midway's defenses completely. This message would prove fateful. Nagumo received it while his second-wave aircraft sat on deck, torpedoes slung beneath their bellies, ready to go after American ships. The Admiral faced a decision. Midway needed another strike. But if American carriers appeared, he would need that reserve wave with its ship-killing torpedoes. He hesitated, considering his options. The debate on Akagi's bridge would stretch on for precious minutes while scouts searched the horizon and staff officers offered conflicting advice. Meanwhile, the American carrier forces were closing in. Fletcher and Spruance had begun their approach during the night, gambling that they could get within striking range before being detected. By dawn, they were roughly 200 miles northeast of the Japanese carriers, just close enough to launch an attack. Fletcher ordered Spruance to launch Enterprise and Hornets air groups immediately. Yorktown would hold back temporarily, maintaining its aircraft as a reserve in case more Japanese carriers were located. This decision meant the initial American strike would come from just 2 carriers. The air groups launched in a rush, squadron after squadron roaring off the flight decks. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, over 100 aircraft climbing into the morning sky. But coordination was poor. The different squadron types flew at different speeds and altitudes. They failed to rendezvous as planned. Instead of arriving together in a coordinated attack, the American air groups would arrive piecemeal, scattered across the sky, each squadron attacking separately instead of in one overwhelming blow. This should have been disastrous. The whole point of a coordinated strike was to overwhelm the defenders, to hit from multiple directions simultaneously so the enemy couldn't concentrate their defenses against any single threat. The Americans had thrown that away through poor coordination and inadequate doctrine. The Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft guns should have slaughtered the scattered American squadrons as they arrived. Back on Akagi, Nagumo had made his decision. He would strike Midway again. The reserve aircraft sitting on deck would be rearmed with bombs instead of torpedoes. Deck crews sprang into action, working with practiced efficiency to remove torpedoes and replace them with bombs. The process was time-consuming, requiring each aircraft to be repositioned, the weapons carefully unloaded and stored, and the new ordnance brought up from below and attached. All of this happened on the crowded flight deck with aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip. Then came the report Nagumo had been dreading. A scout plane had spotted American ships. The message was frustratingly vague. It didn't specify what kinds of ships. It didn't say whether carriers were present. But the mere presence of American surface forces changed everything. If carriers were there, Nagumo needed that reserve strike with torpedoes, not bombs. The order went out. Stop the rearming. Reload the torpedoes. The deck crews, who had been working frantically to remove torpedoes and install bombs, now had to reverse course. Remove the bombs. Bring the torpedoes back up from storage. Reattach them. The flight decks descended into controlled chaos as crews worked desperately to complete the change while the first-wave aircraft from the Midway strike began returning, fuel running low, needing to land immediately. This was the moment where Japanese operational efficiency began to crack. The deck crews were working under immense pressure, trying to rearm aircraft while recovering the Midway strike force, all while knowing that American forces were somewhere out there and could attack at any moment. Safety procedures that would normally be followed carefully were cut short. Bombs that had been removed from aircraft were simply left on the deck instead of being struck below into the magazines. Fuel lines remained connected to aircraft longer than they should have. Deck crew trying to refuel returned aircraft as quickly as possible. The carriers were at their most vulnerable. Flight decks cluttered with aircraft in various states of being armed and fueled. Bombs and torpedoes sitting exposed. Fuel lines running across the deck. The defensive combat air patrol overhead had been drawn down to allow returning aircraft to land. Everything was chaos as Japanese carriers tried to simultaneously recover one strike force, prepare another, and maintain air defenses. The Americans were coming. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet found the Japanese carriers first. 15 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron approached from the south. No fighter cover. No dive bombers to draw fire. Just 15 obsolete torpedo planes against 4 carriers defended by Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Waldron knew it was suicide. He had written letters to be delivered to his family if he didn't return. He led his squadron in any way. The slaughter was absolute. Japanese Zeros fell on the slow, low-flying Devastators like wolves on sheep. American gunners fired back desperately, but the Zeros' speed and maneuverability made them almost impossible to hit. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and their escorts filled the air with deadly shrapnel. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Burning aircraft plunged into the ocean. Crews died in their cockpits or were killed as they parachuted down. A few Devastators made it close enough to launch torpedoes, but the Japanese carriers turned sharply, easily evading the slow-running weapons. Ensign George Gay was the only survivor from Torpedo Squadron 8. His aircraft was hit and crashed. He survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the water, watching the battle unfold from his position in the ocean. 14 aircraft and 29 men were lost. Not a single torpedo hit. It seemed to confirm everything. American aircraft were inferior. American crews were no match for Japanese defenses. The attack had achieved nothing except adding to the casualty count. But Waldron's sacrifice was not in vain, though he would never know it. The Zeros that destroyed his squadron were pulled down to low altitude, drawn away from their high patrol positions. They were low on ammunition from the extended combat. The Japanese carriers had maneuvered violently to evade torpedoes, breaking formation, their careful defensive spacing disrupted. The anti-aircraft guns were trained low, focused on the torpedo threat. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived minutes after Waldron's squadron was destroyed. 14 more Devastators, no fighter cover, heading into the same hell that had just consumed Torpedo Squadron 8. The results were nearly identical. Zeros and anti-aircraft fire tore the squadron apart. Planes fell burning into the sea. Of the 14 aircraft, only 4 would survive long enough to return to Enterprise, and all 4 were damaged. 10 aircraft lost. 20 men dead. 1 torpedo hit on the battleship Haruna that failed to explode, a dud adding insult to catastrophe. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 joined the attack, launching from different direction. 12 aircraft, this time with a fighter escort that tried desperately to protect the vulnerable torpedo planes. The outcome was still terrible. The Wildcats were outnumbered and outclassed by the Zeros. The Devastators were slaughtered. 7 aircraft lost. Another dozen men dead. No hits. In less than 30 minutes, 3 torpedo squadrons had been effectively wiped out. 41 torpedo planes launched. 35 destroyed. 6 survivors so badly damaged they could barely make it back to their carriers. Over 80 men dead or missing. Not a single effective torpedo hit. It was a disaster that seemed to validate every criticism of American naval aviation, every claim that the Japanese were simply too good, too skilled, too well equipped to be beaten. On the decks of the Japanese carriers, crews watched the destruction of the American attacks with grim satisfaction. They had held. The defenses had worked. The Americans had thrown themselves against the Kido Butai and been destroyed. Now it was time to strike back. The reserve wave was nearly ready. Another 30 minutes and they would launch. The American carriers, wherever they were, would be found and destroyed. Victory seemed assured. The dive bomber crews from Enterprise and Yorktown were lost, wandering across the empty ocean, searching for the Japanese carriers that should have been at the coordinates intelligence had provided. The Americans had launched on time and flown the correct heading, but the Japanese force had maneuvered to recover their Midway strike force and evade the torpedo attacks. They were 30 miles from where they should have been. The dive bombers were running low on fuel, their pilots scanning the horizon desperately, knowing that if they didn't find the carriers soon, they would have to ditch in the ocean. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's air group. He had brought 37 Dauntless out from the carrier, his responsibility to find the Japanese and deliver the strike that would justify the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons. He reached the expected position and found empty ocean. A lesser officer might have turned back, conserving fuel to make sure his aircraft could return to the carrier. McCluskey made a different choice. He continued searching, gambling that the Japanese were nearby, gambling that he could find them before fuel ran out. His gamble paid off. A Japanese destroyer racing north left a wake pointing like an arrow across the ocean. McCluskey followed it. At 10:20 in the morning, he spotted them. 4 carriers, churning white wakes across the blue water. Their flight decks were packed with aircraft. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, all being armed and fueled. A perfect target. McCluskey never hesitated. He led his squadrons into the attack. /artifact I've created the opening hook in part 1 of your Midway script, approximately 5,200 words. This establishes the problem: Japan's carrier dominance, their technological and tactical superiority, and the desperate American situation. The narrative follows the same structure as the Firefly story but with completely different content, focusing on the Japanese perspective initially, explaining why they were so dominant, and building tension toward the catastrophic moment. The view from 15,000 feet revealed the complete picture of Japanese vulnerability. 4 carriers steamed in a loose box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft in various states of preparation. Akagi and Kaga formed the port side of the formation. Soryu and Hiryu were to starboard. Between them, the ocean churned white from their wakes as they maneuvered at high speed. Around the carriers, screening vessels maintained their protective stations, their anti-aircraft guns pointing skyward, their crews at battle stations. McCluskey divided his force. He would take Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6 against Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best would lead Enterprise's scouting Squadron 6 against Akagi. The 2 squadrons split, each heading for their assigned target. At nearly the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived overhead with Yorktown's bombing Squadron 3, 17 Dauntless that had found the Japanese independently after their own search. Leslie saw Soryu below and led his squadron into their attack dive. The dive bomber attack profile was brutal in its simplicity. Start at altitude, typically 15,000 feet or higher. Roll inverted. Pull through until the nose points straight down at the target. Deploy dive brakes to control speed. Keep the target centered in the bomb sight as the altimeter spins backward and the ocean rushes up. Release the bomb between 1,500 and 2,000 feet. Pull out of the dive, typically pulling 4 or 5 times. The force of gravity, enough to gray out vision and make it feel like an elephant was sitting on your chest. Level off as low as possible and get away as fast as possible while anti-aircraft fire and fighters try to kill you. Japanese lookouts spotted the American dive bombers and shouted warnings. Anti-aircraft guns began tracking upward, but the dive bombers were coming in from multiple directions simultaneously. The defenders had to split their fire, reducing effectiveness. The Zeros that had been drawn down to low altitude by the torpedo attacks were too low, too slow, too far away to intercept. A few pilots tried climbing desperately to reach the dive bombers, but the Americans were already committed to their dives. There was no time. McCluskey's first section dove on Kaga. The massive carrier twisted in the water, trying to throw off the attacker's aim. Anti-aircraft shells burst around the diving Dauntless, black flowers of shrapnel blooming in the sky. The lead aircraft was hit, pieces of wing tearing away, but the pilot held his dive, released his bomb, and pulled away trailing smoke. The bomb fell true, striking Kaga's flight deck near the superstructure and penetrating before exploding deep inside the ship. More bombs followed. Kaga's deck was packed with armed and fueled aircraft. Bombs sitting exposed where deck crews had left them during the frantic rearming process. Fuel lines still connected to aircraft. When the American bombs hit, they didn't just damage the ship. They triggered a cascading series of internal explosions as the Japanese ordnance cooked off. A bomb struck among parked aircraft, and suddenly aviation fuel was burning across the deck. Another bomb penetrated to the hangar deck below where more armed aircraft waited. The explosion touched off stored torpedoes and bombs. Fire roared through Kaga's interior spaces. The wooden flight deck, treated with preservatives to protect it from salt water, burned with horrifying intensity. Ammunition exploded, sending shrapnel scything through the crowded hangar spaces. Men caught in the open had nowhere to hide. The ship's damage control parties rushed forward with hoses and firefighting equipment, but the fires were spreading faster than they could contain them. Below decks, aviation fuel stored in tanks ruptured from the explosions, pouring burning liquid through compartments. The heat was becoming unbearable. On Akagi, Nagumo watched in horror as Kaga erupted in flames just a few thousand yards away. Then his own ship shuddered from impacts. Lieutenant Best had led Scouting Squadron 6 into their attack at precisely the right moment. 3 bombs hit Akagi in rapid succession. The first struck just aft of the midship elevator, blowing a massive hole in the flight deck and starting fires on the hangar deck below. The second hit near the port edge of the flight deck, destroying several aircraft and starting more fires. The third bomb struck amidships, penetrating to the upper hangar deck and exploding among parked aircraft. Like Kaga, Akagi's deck was crowded with armed aircraft. The bomb explosions touched off fuel and ammunition. Within seconds, the flagship of the Kido Butai was burning. Flames spread with terrifying speed. The ship's air officer, Commander Fukuda Mitsuo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, stood on deck watching his ship die. He had been wounded by shrapnel during the attack, his ankles broken, but he refused to leave his post. Around him, aircraft burned. Explosions rippled across the deck as ordnance cooked off. Soryu never had a chance. Leslie's squadron from Yorktown came screaming down out of the sun while the ship's attention was focused on the attacks developing against Kaga and Akagi. The first warning Soryu's crew had was the scream of dive brakes as 13 Dauntless plummeted toward them. 3 bombs hit. One struck near the forward elevator, blowing it out of its well and starting massive fires on the hangar deck. A second bomb hit amidships among the packed aircraft. The third struck aft. Like her sisters, Soryu was transformed from a functioning warship into a floating inferno in moments. The time was 10:25 in the morning, June 4, 1942. 5 minutes had elapsed since McCluskey had spotted the Japanese carriers and led his dive bombers into their attack. In those 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 most powerful aircraft carriers in the Japanese Navy had been mortally wounded. The Kido Butai, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, which had struck Pearl Harbor and ranged across 2 oceans destroying everything in its path, had been gutted. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo stood in stunned silence. Reports flooded in from all parts of the ship. Fires out of control. Magazines in danger of exploding. Casualties mounting. The flight deck was unusable, twisted metal and burning wreckage. There would be no launching aircraft from Akagi. The Admiral's staff urged him to transfer his flag to a cruiser so he could maintain command. Nagumo seemed paralyzed, unable to process the speed and totality of the disaster. Captain Aoki Taijiro, commanding officer of Akagi, made the decision for him. The ship was doomed. The Admiral needed to save himself and his staff to continue commanding the battle. Nagumo allowed himself to be led to the deck. A rope was lowered over the side, and the admiral, his staff officers following, climbed hand over hand down to a boat waiting below. As he descended, Nagumo could see the full extent of the catastrophe. Kaga was a blazing wreck to port. Soryu burned to starboard. His own ship was being consumed by fire behind him. Hiryu, the fourth carrier, had been operating separately from the other three, positioned some distance away. She had not been caught in the American dive bomber attack. Her aircraft were being prepared for a counterstrike. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Taman, commanding Hiryu in the 2nd Carrier Division, took tactical command of the battle. He ordered an immediate strike against the American carriers. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck, heading east toward where the American carriers had to be. On Kaga, the crew fought desperately to save their ship. Damage control parties wearing breathing apparatus advanced into the smoke-filled interior spaces, dragging hoses, trying to contain the fires. But the blazes had spread too far, too fast. Explosions continued to rock the ship as stored ammunition detonated. The heat melted metal. Paint blistered on bulkheads. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Captain Okada Jisaku, the ship's commanding officer, refused to abandon ship while any hope remained. He remained on the bridge, directing firefighting efforts, even as the deck beneath his feet grew too hot to stand on. By noon, it was clear that Kaga could not be saved. The fires had reached the forward magazines. The ship was in danger of a catastrophic explosion that would kill everyone still aboard. Okada gave the order to abandon ship. Sailors threw ropes over the side and slid down to boats. Others simply jumped into the water, preferring to take their chances in the ocean rather than burn. The wounded were lowered on stretchers. The dead were left behind. There were hundreds of them, men who had died in the explosions, who had been trapped in compartments below the fires, who had been killed by shrapnel or ammunition explosions. Okada was among the last to leave his ship. He watched as boats filled with survivors pulled away from the burning hulk. Kaga had been his home, his responsibility. He had trained on her, risen to command her. Now she was dying, and there was nothing he could do. Destroyers came alongside to pick up survivors from the water. The rescues continued through the afternoon as the carrier settled lower in the water, her internal structure weakened by fire and explosions. Akagi's fate was similar. The fires could not be contained. Explosions continued as the flames found new sources of fuel and ammunition. Captain Aoki ordered the crew to abandon ship late in the afternoon. Like Okada, he remained aboard to the last, ensuring that everyone who could be saved was off the ship. The cruiser Nagara came alongside to take off survivors. Sailors lined the rails, watching their ship burn. Many wept openly. Akagi had been the flagship, the pride of the fleet. She had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. She had struck targets across the Pacific. Now she was a floating pyre. Soryu burned fastest of the three. The hits she had taken from Yorktown's dive bombers had started fires that spread with horrifying speed. The ship's captain, Yanajimoto Ryasaku, ordered abandon ship within hours of being hit. He refused to leave himself, choosing to go down with his ship. Officers and men begged him to reconsider. He would not. When the last boats pulled away, Yanajimoto stood on the bridge, singing the Japanese national anthem as flames consumed the superstructure around him. He was last seen standing at attention, facing toward the Imperial Palace, as Soryu slipped beneath the waves. The Japanese strike from Hiryu found Yorktown in mid-afternoon. The American carrier had recovered her aircraft from the morning strike and was preparing to launch a second attack when Japanese dive bombers appeared. Yorktown's combat air patrol intercepted, shooting down several attackers, but others broke through. 3 bombs hit the carrier. One struck the flight deck, penetrating to the hangar deck and starting fires. Another hit the smokestack, destroying the uptakes and reducing the ship's speed. A third bomb struck near the island superstructure, causing significant damage. Yorktown's crew fought the fires with practiced efficiency. American damage control doctrine emphasized training every sailor in firefighting. The crew compartmentalized the fires, controlled the damage, and within an hour had restored the ship to operation. The fires were out. Speed was back up to 20 knots. The flight deck was patched enough to operate aircraft. American damage control had proven itself superior to Japanese practice. But Hiryu wasn't done. Yamaguchi launched a second strike, this time torpedo bombers. 10 Kates escorted by. Fighters found Yorktown and pressed home their attack. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down half the attackers, but 4 torpedoes hit the carrier. The explosions tore massive holes in Yorktown's hull below the waterline. The ship took on an immediate list. Power failed throughout the ship. Fires that had been controlled earlier reignited. This time, the damage was too severe. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship. The Americans had lost a carrier. But they had accounted for 3 Japanese carriers already, and they weren't done. Scouting aircraft from Enterprise had located Hiryu. Spruance ordered a strike launched immediately. 24 dive bombers took off from Enterprise, raced west, and found the last operational Japanese carrier. They attacked just before sunset. 4 bombs hit Hiryu. The same pattern repeated. Fires on the flight deck. Explosions in the hangar. The wooden deck burning. Within minutes, Hiryu joined her sisters as a flaming wreck, her flight deck unusable, fires spreading through her interior. Admiral Yamaguchi remained on his burning flagship. Like the captains of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, he chose to share his ship's fate. He had been the most aggressive of the Japanese carrier admirals, constantly pushing for offensive action. Now his aggressiveness had brought him to this. His ship was dying, and he had no desire to survive her. When the order came to abandon ship, Yamaguchi went to the bridge with Hiryu's captain, Kakutomio. The 2 men sat, shared a final meal, and waited as fires consumed the ship around them. By nightfall on June 4th, all 4 of the Kido Butai's carriers were burning wrecks. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had been abandoned, their crews picked up by destroyers. Hiryu was still afloat but doomed, her crew abandoning ship as darkness fell. The most powerful carrier striking force ever assembled had been destroyed in a single day. The battle wasn't quite over. Fighting would continue the next day as American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. A few more ships would be sunk on both sides. But the decisive action had occurred in those 5 minutes at 10:20 in the morning when American dive bombers had found the Japanese carriers vulnerable and struck with devastating effect. The question that has haunted naval historians ever since is how could this have happened? How could 4 carriers, protected by fighters and anti-aircraft guns, manned by experienced crews, commanded by officers who had fought successfully for 6 months, be destroyed so quickly and completely? The answer lies in a combination of factors, each individually significant, but together creating the perfect conditions for disaster. Japanese combat air patrol doctrine was flawed. The carriers maintained standing patrols of fighters overhead, rotating aircraft to ensure constant coverage. But the patrols were too small, typically just a handful of Zeros for all 4 carriers. When the American torpedo attacks came in at wave after wave, the Zeros were pulled down to low altitude to intercept. This left the high-altitude zones undefended. When the dive bombers arrived, they came from above, from the one direction the fighters weren't covering. Better combat air patrol management, with fighters stationed at multiple altitudes, might have intercepted at least some of the dive bombers before they could attack. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.